This week's shir is sponsored by Rabbi Michael and Jerry Laxmeter for the foolish name of the granddaughter Avigail Sarah Bat Shena Aharona. Any improvement? Baruch Hashem. Baruch Hashem. She should continue to heal and to be 100%. So this week's parsha is Parshat Mishpatim. This week's parsha is Parshat Mishpatim. Ve'ele, you got that vav, which is discussed a lot. Ve'ele mishpatim asher tasim lefneihem. Ki tikneh eved ivri, shesh shanim yavod v'shviyit yitzei lechavshi chinam. So I just want to pause there for a second. There's something here already about this first law, this first mishpat, if you will, that should be exceedingly jarring and disturbing. I mean, the truth is, I don't know how much it really bothers us. The whole concept of Eved Ivri, or for that matter, what we would call slavery, although obviously you would need a more precise definition to what exactly are the limitations or the freedoms which are enjoyed by such a person. But the very fact that it's called Eved, again, part of what's jarring is that it's Eved Ivri, and therefore what you're talking about is within our community is that there will be a Jew who will be an indentured servant. Again, whatever that word will be, I'm going to stay with servitude for today, and he has become engaged within a situation of servitude. So now, part of the reason why this should be jarring is, okay, now just to back up a little bit, to say, ask the simple question, well, how did we get here, and what's going on, and what is this whole parsha about? So the observation, which is one which I think almost anybody who reads this should sense, is that there is a correlation between the various laws or the mishpatim which are mentioned in this week's parsha and the Aseret HaDibrot which we have seen in last week's parsha. How closely they're correlated, it's 100% or no, or again, that's something that we could discuss, we could debate, we can see what's here, what's not there, and we can look at the similarities and the differences, but still nonetheless, when perhaps you note that in the very first Dibur, now this is something you all know because Rashi cites it and the Gemara says it, and that is from the very beginning we have God introducing himself as Anochi, I'm God who took you out of Mitzrayim, Asher hotzeticha me'eretz mibeit avadim, lo yelecha Elohim acherim al panai. So there is going to be something which is interesting about this. First of all, we're still dealing with the first Dibur. The first Dibur is, I am God. So what exactly does that mean? But it's not just that I'm God, there's these other elements. I am God who took you out of servitude. So now you have a situation of a person who finds himself back in a situation of servitude. So that leads us to this thought, and it's going to start on a micro level, have we just now undone part of what God did? Maybe that's the way to put it. And the Gemara in source number 2, as I said, this will sound very familiar to you from Rashi, because Rashi really uses this. I just figure that maybe it's better off just to go to the source. He would use this as material. Manishtana. So we're more familiar with that phrase, manishtana, which is, by the way, we find it in a Pesach theme, obviously. I once discussed this with Rav Lichtenstein, asking about these other manishtanot. And his answer was, we have to research this more. Manishtana ozen mikol evrim shabaguf. Afterwards, we're told back in source number 1, is the fellow who says, I want to remain in a relationship of servitude. I like this situation. So then we're told, V'gishu adanav ela Elohim, which is the judge in this context, V'gishu ela delet or la mezuzah, and you take him to the doorpost, and then you put this hole in his ear. Now that's really interesting because you know that the Eved that I mentioned that we were in Beit Avadim is part of the Aseret HaDibrot, but it's reflecting back to Mitzrayim. On the other hand, when we ask ourselves a very easy question, when did I ever see doorposts mentioned before? And then the answer is that was part of the ritual of leaving Egypt, that we took the blood and put it on the doorpost of the Korban Pesach, and that was part of the liberation. So is this really trying to talk about or to express that somehow this person is undoing the liberation, again, on a personal, economic level, and that would be quite disturbing. But there is something which is more disturbing, which hovers beyond all this, and I don't know if that occurred to you yet. This is speaking, again, starting off right away, but it's speaking on an individual basis about one person who's going to behave like that. But is there a possibility on a national level to regress and go back to a situation of servitude, which means what was the leaving of Egypt a permanent solution, or is it something which is negotiable depending upon behavior? And right away, when we hear about a micro situation where an individual is able to regress, lose his economic freedom, and the term which is used is evid. And then I said part of it is maybe it's better, maybe it's worse that the master is another Jew. Again, you understand why it's better, because hopefully there'll be compassion. The Gemara, especially Rishalmi, talks about all kinds of considerations why if you somehow took for yourself a servant, you really have acquired a master when you consider all the ways and obligations that you have to treat him properly. But nonetheless, the fact that a Jew is enslaved by another Jew, and again, maybe that's too strong of a word, but you have to realize there's something wrong about this. But the Gemara continues, why in the ear? And it says, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ozen sheshama koli al har Sinai b'shah she'amarti ki li b'nei Yisrael avadim v'lo avadim la'avadim. That you are my servants and not servants to servants. Now, I want you to keep that turn of phrase in mind. We're going to come back to that in a very unexpected way. Right? You don't know where I'm going. I'm just going to tell you right now. We have to always have at least some surprise in this. So this, but lo avadim la'avadim, but not a servant to servants. V'alach zeh kana Adan la'atzmo yeratza. And this person found a master for himself. And again, I'm going to say something which maybe you didn't hear me say yet, and that is, Anochi talks about I am God. There's two ways you can have another master. One way you can have another master is by losing your economic freedom. The other way is actually much closer to the context of Anochi, and that is to worship a different God. That's also taking a different master. So therefore, what's taking place over here is a really interesting combination between what we would call economic and political freedom, and on the other hand, religious freedom as well. And leaving Egypt, Yetziat Mitzrayim does both. Anochi, according to this, is addressing both. This person has regressed in one level. Do we have some kind of a hint of a possibility of regressing on the other one as well? The Gemara continues, Rabbi Shimon bin Rabbi Eliezer, I believe that would be, Hayador Shetem Karzeh Kimin Chomer, Manish Tanadelet Umizuza Mikol Kelim Shibabayet Amakodesh Baruch Hu Del Muzah Shayu Edim B'Mitzrayim B'Shasha Pasachti Amashkof El Shtei Mezuzot V'Amarti Kili B'nei Yisrael Avadim V'Lo Avadim La'Avadim V'Tzeitim Avdut L'Cherut. Again, what we already had intuited, we find very clearly being expressed by the Gemara as well. So you have this individual who is undoing the Anochi, and he's undoing the Passover freedom, and rather taking a relationship of servitude. Now, before we go in a more expected way, I just want to go in the other direction for a moment. I can argue, and obviously when I say I can argue, it gets a lot of you excited, because then you figure, oh, I can argue also. I could argue that the extension of the Aseret HaDibrot takes place in three different places. One place is over here in Mishpatim, which I think is, again, fairly clear. The second place, the Midrash points out and does the analysis and the associations and all the heavy lifting for you, is in Parashat Kedoshim. And the third place is, let's see, that was easy. And the third place should be the most obvious one of all, and that is in Ve'et Hanan. Why Ve'et Hanan? Because that's where the Servitudes are mentioned again. Now, in these, let's be easier about this. Certainly in Vayikra, we'll see about Mishpatim soon, because that's what we want to talk about. Mishpatim, it's going to become obvious as well. But certainly, if you work through Vayikra, specifically Parshat Kedoshim. If you want to be a little bit more creative, going from Achrei Mot into Kedoshim, you want to be more creative, Achrei Mot into Kedoshim to the end of the book, and I'll explain to you why in a moment, then something happens which is not obviously there more than one half of a phrase, maybe, in the Servitudes Dibrot. And if you look in the Sefer Devarim, it becomes, again, completely clear. And what is that? That it speaks about the land of Israel, which means notice something which you may or may not have noticed last week. And that is the Servitudes Dibrot does not speak about the land of Israel, except for maybe one turn of phrase. And that itself is interesting, because some of us, especially some of us sitting here, would be very tempted to say that a central aspect of Judaism is the land of Israel. If you want, I can rephrase this, and again, go back to that pivotal moment that Moshe happens upon God by the burning bush, which is Sinai, and God says, I'm God, and we are going to take them out. I'm going to take them to the land which I promised Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and take them to the land which flows in milk and honey, and that's the destination. That's what the whole story is about. If you lost that, you kind of lost the narrative. You've lost the plot. You really don't know what's going on, and that's been the plot from Bereshit going on till this moment, and then this little slight thing, oh yeah, by the way, I'll give you a sign. When you take them out, you'll serve God on this mountain. That's a detour, but doesn't change the destination. If you want to, then we can then say that we have dual destinations when we leave Egypt, but one is Sinai, the other one is still the land of Israel, which is clearly the ultimate destination. But what's interesting now is this observation that this first detour doesn't make any mention of where we're going. Now, here is really something which is ominous. And I go back to my question. Is liberation as expressed in the first Dibur, Anochi, right? You have it in front of you. Who took you out of Egypt? Who took you out of servitude? Don't worship any other gods. So then the question runs out. You can imagine somebody raising their hand and ask, especially if it's a Jewish kid sitting in class saying, well, what if we do? What if we do? Yeah, I just want to know what exactly is the punishment before. Right, you know that there are people who are going to be asking such questions. I can deal with this. So it seems to be, and again, here's a point you could disagree with me. It's okay. It seems to be that the Servitudes Dibrot, by not discussing the land of Israel, seem to be acknowledging that the Jewish people have an obligation to serve God, whether they're in the land of Israel or not, which means hopefully no one's going to say, oh, Shabbat, that's only the land of Israel. I'm out of Israel, I don't have to keep Shabbat. Hopefully no one's going to say that about some of the other ones as well when you get to the left side of the Dibrot. No, that doesn't apply, that doesn't apply. These are only Israel-centric. No. The Servitudes Dibrot apply all over, and these are universals. But I'm saying by even giving that statement, that it applies all over, has within it something which is potentially a negative interpretation, by then understanding that there is this possibility that this is not going to work out, and if it doesn't work out, it doesn't mean that the covenant is over. It doesn't mean that there's no obligations. It just means that we're undeserving of that thing that was promised at this particular moment, which means the promise is the promise, and then we'll have to wait a little bit longer until we're able to enter into the land, or to return to the land. But nonetheless, the rules that you have gotten into, the Nasa v'Nishma, as it were, still is going to apply, and you still have upon you the Servitudes Dibrot. So the lack of the mention of Israel within the Servitudes Dibrot should be something which is a little bit jarring. Now you go back to Vayikra, and Kedoshim is a restatement. Kedoshim was introduced by Achrei Mot. That's why I went back there. Achrei Mot has a whole section of laws that have to do with sexual impropriety. There it says very clearly, if you don't follow these laws, the land will vomit you out. It is about the land. Then we get into Kedoshim, and Kedoshim is talking about things which have to do with holiness, and it goes back to the land. It leads back to the land when you get to Emor, all the holidays mentioned in terms of the land. It leads back when you get to Bahar, which is all that land. It finally gets to Bechukotai. And I'll remind you, if you don't remember this, then you'll have to go find an old lecture that I gave about this. But I'll remind you that in this week's parsha, Moshe reads to them the Sefer HaBrit, according to a good deal of Rishonim, a lot of them the Balei Tosfot. You want specifically to see one, you can look at the Chizkuni, but there are numerous other ones who claim that the book that Moshe read to them, the Sefer HaBrit, before they said Nasa v'Nishma, it's the same pasuk. Moshe took out and read to them Sefer Brit, and then they said to the Sefer HaBrit, Nasa v'Nishma. Clearly Rashi is going to have to smooth things over in a different way. But Chizkuni says, what's the Sefer HaBrit? That's Parsha B'Chukotai. At the end of B'Chukotai it says, and this is the covenant that God made, the Brit that God made with the people of Israel by Har Sinai. This is what was said by Sinai. Sefer Vayikra didn't start by Sinai. Sefer Vayikra starts by the Oel Moed. The end of it reverts back and it tells us about the Brit. And this is all about being in the land or being kicked out of the land. That's what B'Chukotai is about. So if you follow all of Vayikra, again, getting to the restatement of their Servitudes, getting to this point of holiness. Holiness will allow us to live in a holy place, but if we don't follow the holiness, we will not be able to live in a holy place, and we're going to find ourselves in exile. And guess what? Then we still have an obligation of keeping the law, although we can't keep as many laws. There are different kinds of opportunities. A whole bunch of things were lost. You want to go take a look again at Sefer Devarim. The whole thing is about avoiding avodah zarah, avoiding idolatry, avadim heim. And then you look at the restatement of the Servitudes there, the major focus is clearly on avoiding avodah zarah and therefore deserving to live in the land, which means that it is a restatement going towards this other issue, which I'm going to say it again now. It's really interesting that the Servitudes kinds of skips it. But as I said, there is something ominous there in the background, which then leads us to this other question in terms of maybe understanding Mishpatim a little bit better. And I'm going to say, this is not going to be hard for us to see in Mishpatim the direction that it goes. It'll just take a little bit of time. All that you needed to do is go from the beginning of the parsha and say, where do I see Israel? Now the truth is that a lot of the laws which are mentioned, how or to what extent a court system is able to do these things outside of the land, and how there are technical issues involved. And I'd prefer the whole discussion not to get lost in technicalities, but I don't want to avoid those either. But if you go back and look at the Servitudes and look at source number 3, and again, you have Anochi, and you have not to worship other gods, and not to take God's name in vain. Again, all of these are universal. Shabbat, which is universal. And then you get to one law, and that is the 5th Dibur, and that's Pasuk Yud Bet, Kabed et avicha v'et imecha, honor your father and mother, lima'an, in order, ya'arichun yamecha ala adama asher Hashem Elokecha noten lach, in order to lengthen the days that you will live on the land which the Lord your God gave you. Now, there's two possibilities here. One is just to read the words and say, well, what does that mean? And it sounds very much like it's talking about the land of Israel, which then would actually cause us to pause for a moment and then raise the following, and then it continues: Lo tirtzach, lo tigno, lo tigno, lo tanaberach ha'idshach, lo tachmod, and so on and so forth. And then there is no reference to the land of Israel, which means, why is this the outlier? Which means that then becomes the question. If it's not mentioned in the context of any of the others, then why is it mentioned over here? Which means either all of Servitudes should be these things which apply all over, and then you also, obviously the way I phrased it just now, come up with another question. So, outside of the land of Israel, I don't have to honor my parents? Or is it, of course, saying something else, that in the land of Israel there is an additional reward for it, but that doesn't mean that the obligation, meaning this is what you get for it, that doesn't mean the obligation doesn't apply otherwise. But nonetheless, the way I'm phrasing this question now is, why is this the outlier? Which means, what is this? What's going on here? What is the deeper message I've missed? What is it that I need to still ask myself? And I'm going to say this now just to make this clear. Everything I've said till now are things which already were percolating in my mind going from Sunday morning. I told you on Sunday I try to go through Steinmik V'Echel, and already on Sunday morning I was troubled on this already from last week. I was thinking about the Servitudes in terms of Eretz Yisrael, and as I was reading through Mishpatim, which again follows up on it, I was looking for it, charting it, seeing where we get there, and all of these things I was looking for a solution. So try that again. We still have our Eved Ivri, which is jarring, rejection of Anochi, possibility of reverting. Implication is possibly reverting not just on an individual level, but on a national level, rejecting Anochi, not just in an inference of Anochi, but rejecting Anochi. And then where does that take us when we are guilty of Avodah Zarah? And we know where that takes us. That leads towards expulsion, that leads towards Galut, that leads towards Churban. When we go back and look at the Servitudes, that's when we get jarred the second time, when we realize it's not talking about the same destination that we thought it should have been talking about when we listened at the snare. Okay, there's a short stop to make, right? No, the stop that we made there seems to ignore the destination that we have, and therefore what it's actually saying is it's still the destination, but even when you're not there, you're still going to have these rules that you have to live by. And as I said, there is this other thing that needs to be worked out. We have our issue of our servitude, right, of the Eved Ivri, and the servitude of exile. We have our servitude of serving other gods. So therefore, we have all these different aspects of servitudes that we had, including, we liked the term of Yekiliv Bnei Yisrael Avadim V'lo Avadim LaAvadim, which also is a term that we liked and we're still mystified with. The Ibn Ezra in source number 4 says, Kaveret Vicha Kariskarti B'chamisha Dvrim Arishonim Zecher Hashem. He notes, and the Ramban normally is the one who gets credited for this. I don't know why, but the Ibn Ezra is kind of ignored. We like to say that the first 5 commandments are about man and God, and the second 5 are interpersonal. And what's interesting about that is the 5th one is Kaveda Tevicha Vetimecha. So is that interpersonal or is that in terms of God? So he points out, no, that's still in terms of God. And as I said, the Ramban goes in that direction as well, because ultimately, when you ask, why should I honor my parents? Because my parents brought me into this world and they give me life and they give me sustenance and they take care of me and so on. And then you have to ask yourself the other question. So who ultimately brought me into this world and who ultimately gives me sustenance and who ultimately takes care of me? Which means the same emotion that I have towards my parents should fuel a type of emotion that we have in terms of God. And therefore, the objective of this is not, meaning the way you fulfill this commandment is by honoring one's parents. But the objective, emotionally, psychologically, and religiously should be that I should foster a relationship with God as well for the exact same reason. So therefore, the objective of all 5 of the first commandments are in terms of the man to God relationship. And the objective of the second 5 is one which is interpersonal. So that would seem to be the way to understand this Ibn Ezra as well. The Ibn Ezra notes a little down the line, V'harachti yamim, v'avor mitzvah shetaseh nimtza ata marich yamim, v'amar el ha'adama, ki asher Yisrael, yishamru Yisrael, zot ha'mitzvah, lo yigalu mimeno. So it seems to be saying there's something special about honoring parents. You honor your parents, there will not be an exile. So once again, that's interesting, and once again, we have to ask ourselves, why specifically this? I mean, I could have said, avoiding idolatry should be a good thing. I could have said keeping Shabbat's a good thing. I mean, I could have said this by others, so I'm still left with my same question. And what is it? Why is this the outlier? Why is this the one which has this promise to it? The Ramban in source 5, again, says a lot of the same thing. Kaveda Tevicha, Hinei hishlim kol ma she'anu chayivim b'divrei haborei ba'atzmo chodo b'chazot sodanu b'inei hanivraim. And again, you can go and read through in order to understand. But again, he goes in the similar direction. He, though, ends up bringing in the Gemara, and I'll just tell you as follows. The Gemara seems to imply, he makes it sound like it's not exclusively. The Gemara seems to imply that long life over here is Olam Haba, and not necessarily the land of Israel. As I said, it's Olam Haba, that you honor your parents, you will get Olam Haba, but presumably any of the commandments you bring Olam Haba. So again, why is this the outlier? Why is it stated over here? But the Ramban seems to go in that direction as well. Perhaps he understands it as being both, but there is a Gemara that takes you in that direction. The Sforno is really interesting because he parses the verse a little differently, and it's not so easy what he does. I just want to go back and look at the verse for a moment again. It is still in source number 3, and in Pasuk Yud Bet, Kabeda tavicha vetimecha, L'ma'an yirichun yamecha al adama asher Hashem Elokecha noten lach. And he says that this is the conclusion of the first five. Just for our sake, imagine the first five, and then imagine, because it's not what he says. You push enter, because he's in the middle of a pasuk. You push enter, you get a new line, and then it has the conclusion of the first five. So he's claiming it's not an outlier. He's claiming L'man Yarichun is for all five. Let's look at the words of the Sforno right now. L'man Yarichun Yamecha, Elu HaChamisha Dibrot B'Shmiratan Yarichun Yamecha. The grammar, the words, it didn't say it, I know.
We've been told all along our entire lives
Yeah.
that it's the doctor that gets that for us, not the others.
So anyway, this Sforno is really interesting because he cut the verse in half, and he claims that it's, again, visually is what's interesting, because he's imagining the right side and the left side, and therefore he's imagining the bottom of the right side of these words, and therefore it's for everything on the right side. In order to do that, you have to kind of cut the pasuk.
Yeah. Now, on the left side, you'll need a conclusion of that, right?
Symmetry.
So you have to look at the end of the left side, but that's not my concern. My concern right now is the Sforno claiming, what did he accomplish? He's saying that all five of the man to God laws have this benefit to them. Again, it's interesting. He does talk about the others at the end. You can take a look. Okay, if we return back, so far, where are we? We have our problem with our servitude. Then we have our problem with the land of Israel. We have our problem with, can we reverse this on this macro level? We have our problem now of why is Kibbut Av V'Ein the outlier? And we see various attempts to claim that it's not. So when you go to source number 7, we've moved to Perek Kaf Gimel. In Perek Kaf Gimel, there is no doubt whatsoever that in Parshat Mishpatim that we moved towards the land of Israel. I'm just saying, this is unavoidable. It's not debatable, which means don't try to debate. It talks about Shemitah, V'sheishalim tizar et artsecha, your land. I mean, this is land-based. V'shvi tishmetena, and the 7th year is going to be the sabbatical, and so on. It continues, and it says Shalosh regalim tachugli b'shana. There's going to be 3 holidays, and the holidays here are mentioned in terms of their agricultural identity, right? Chag HaAviv, Spring Festival, Chag HaKatzir, Bikurei Maasecha, Shetizra B'Sadeh, V'Chag HaAsif B'Sof HaShana, V'Asfacha Et Maasecha Min HaSadeh, all agricultural, all having to do with seasons. Pasuk Yud Zayin, Shalosh P'em B'Shana Yira'eh Kol Zorcha El Pnei Hadon Hashem. And it talks about making a pilgrimage. Again, this should be interesting also for those who are going to claim, the Mishkan was only introduced after the Chet Egel. This is really interesting, because here it talks about making a pilgrimage. Look at the next couple of verses, Pasuk Yutet especially, Reishit Bikirei Admatcha. What do you do at your first fruits? The Bikurim, Tavi Beit Hashem Elokecha. Bring them up to the house of God. So I'm going to say it again, all of this is agricultural, all of this is land-based, all of this is about the land of Israel. This is the Beit HaMikdash. These are the laws of Zra'im, the laws of Kachim, Korbanot. It's all staring at you over here. I mean, it even talks about Lo Tizbach al Chametz Dam Zivchi. I skipped that verse, but it's also talking about offerings. It's Korbanot, it's Beit HaMikdash, it's working the land. And that leads us directly, that was Pasuk Yutet, and that leads us directly to Pasuk Kaf. Hinei anochi sholoach malach lefanecha. I'm going to send now you'll tell me how you want me to translate malach right now? How do you understand malach? Representative, emissary, or malach, an angel.
Sorry, could you say that again?
Doubtful. It's bad enough I said it the first time. So you're going to send Hinei anochi sholoach malach lefanecha l'shmecha b'derech uleviacha el hamakom asher hachinoti, and bring you to the place which I've prepared for you. Okay. First of all, it's very interesting. It's such a nice way of saying it. I'm going to send someone to lead you in and take you to the place that I got ready for you. It's like, I booked the hotel. Everything was ready. The chocolate's on the pillow. If the bed's turned down, I've prepared everything for you, and now I'm going to send someone to just make sure that you get there okay, and everything is safe. So it's a great pasuk, I think. But then we have pasuk Kaf Aleph, He shamer mi panav ushma b'kolo al temarbo ki lo yisal l'peshechem ki shemi b'kirbo. You better listen. That already got a little ominous again. Ki im shema'ot tishma b'kolo, say it in the positive, vasita kol asher daber, vayafti et oivecha v'tzarti et tzarecha. I will take care of your enemies. Your enemies will be my enemies. But of course you realize if you follow my word, and then again, our kid in the class should be raising his hand and saying, well, what if I don't? And then you already know what if you don't, then God says, the implication is I won't be fighting your battles. Lo tishtachaveh le'elohehem v'lo ta'avdeim. See, we've only got to the same place that I wanted to from the beginning. What is that? It's the other side of Anochi, right? Don't serve other gods. Meaning when you get there, don't rebel against me. Don't serve local gods. Don't serve the Canaanite gods. Lo ta'avdeim. So now you realize where I started at the very beginning, where we become slaves to other people who I've set you free, and now we've reversed, but God set us free from being in Egypt, which we were underneath this other, not just economic and not just political, but also this other religious system whereby the Egyptian gods were dominating our lives as well. And if you go to the land of Israel and revert, so that now we see is the problem. So Let's state the easy part. What's the easy part? Does Parshat Mishpatim talk about the land of Israel? Of course it does. Which means when we have this expansion of the Servitudes, is there going to be something which is land-based? Of course it is. And you just have it in a really clear sense. If you even want to say that the holidays over here are an expansion of Shabbat, right? You have various types of Shabbatot, various types of days where you have to have days of rest and not do creative work, or not do work, so then it works really nice. And you actually did have it, I skipped it, but you had an interesting flow of information going from Shemitah to Pasuk Yud Bet, which I had skipped, Sheishit Mim Taseh Masech of Yom HaShvi Tishbot, L'man Yinuach Shorcha V'chamarcha V'yinafesh Ben Amatech V'ager, right, in order to have a day of rest. And then it went directly to Shalosh Regalim, to the holidays. So therefore, seeing the holidays as expansion of Shabbat and seeing Mishpatim as an expansion of Servitudes, all that's easy. But what do you see very clearly over here? You see the land of Israel staring at you in various ways. But what you're also told is do not serve their gods. When you continue, Lo tia mashke levakara ba'artzecha, et mispar yomecha malei, we'll go a little further. V'shalachti et tzura lefanecha, v'girsha et I'm going to chase them all out, not at once, slowly, and it goes to this whole way about how the conquest will take place. Pasuk Lamed Gimel, Lo yishvu ba'artzecha pen yachti otcha li ki ta'avod et Eloheihem ki elecha lemokesh. Again, serving the other gods will be catastrophic ultimately. So when we ask ourselves this question, can this be reversed? It can be. There is nonetheless much more of a debate regarding how to read that verse about him sending my malach. Rashi, well, first we'll look at the more positive ways. The Ibn Ezra said all the things you wanted to say in source number 8. He says the malach, he says, if you accept all the mishpatim, all the laws, then I'm going to bring you to land. And lots of people have made mistakes regarding understanding this. Hamalach is a Sefer Torah, and some say it's our own Habrit. And he says no, and he brings various pieces of information from Breshit where we find malach being used in a very positive way. If you want, you can look where he brings one, which is when Avraham sends his Eved to find a wife for Yitzchak. Hashem Elokei Hashemayim asher lakachani mibeit avi ume'artzi moladati. Okay, God has guided me. He says, "Hu yishlach malacho lefanecha." He's going to send his emissary in order to help you. Or we find Yaakov saying, "Hamalach hagoeloti." So we find various ways where a malach is something positive, and it is a malach, whatever malach means. Ibn Ezra doesn't engage that much here what it means. He leaves it a little bit mysterious, but it's God somehow micromanaging and sending an emissary to make sure that God's will takes place, which, by the way, sounds extremely positive. The Rashbam, Yeshua. Instead of going backwards, he goes, look by Yeshua, and Yeshua does meet this mysterious individual, if you recall this, and he connects it with something that will take place in the future. The Bechor Shor, Navi, Shaliach, somehow somebody who is on a mission from God becomes God's emissary. Rashi, however, comes back to our ominous feeling. Hinei anochi sholeach malach, Kahn nitbasru sha'atidin lichto. And here they were informed that they are going to sin. V'shchina omeret lahem, ki lo ale bikirbacha. As God is going to say to them, I'm not going in their midst. So Rashi does a really interesting thing over here. This is not even our famous theory of conservation of angels. It's something else. He looks at source number 12. Where does source number 12 come up? Right after the Chet HaEgel. Initially, God's first offer is, I'm going to wipe them out. And Moshe argues and saves and so on. And then God gives in to Moshe. He accepts the prayers, and that's source number 12, Perek Lamed Gimel. וידבר שם משה לך למי זה אתה ועם אשר עלית מארץ מצרים אל הארץ אשר נשבעתי לאבותיך יעקב לאמור לזרעך תננה. Fine, you're right. I made a promise. Take your people out. This is where the Erev Rav kind of things becomes a subtext. Go, take them out. V'shalachti lefanecha malach. And this sounds great. And I'll send my malach. So Rashi essentially is saying, here when it says v'shalachti lecha malach, and previously when it says that ki alech malachi lefanecha, it's the same thing. V'shalachti lefanecha malach. This is the malach lefanecha or lefanecha malach, and that's what Rashi is noting. V'gerashti kaniyim v'chiviva, and that's the same thing. I mean, that's what was said in our context as well, which is why it leads Rashi to the same thing. But then the other shoe drops. Right, which all sounds great. Ki lo e'ele bikir b'cha. Because I'm not going to go in your midst. Because you are stiff-necked people, and I keep telling you that's a term which is introduced exclusively after and in relationship to serving other gods, specifically to the Chet HaEgel. And you are so bad, if I'm in your midst, and I punish you right away for the things that you do, you're not going to make it. And therefore, it's in your best interest that we not have that kind of relationship, rather that I am a little bit more distant and only my malach. Now, before we read any further over here, the Ramban in 13 takes issue with Rashi. He tells us, he quotes Rashi, and he writes, "Vatshuva lefi hadat hazot, ki hagzera hahi lo nitkaima im Moshe biyamav." He says, what are you talking about? Did you read the next couple of verses? The next couple of verses, Moshe davens, and he prays to God, and he says, excuse me, you hired me to take them out. If you're not in our midst, how in the world are we going to make it? Meaning, he pushes back and he counters at the very end of source number 2, which is source number 12, which is Perek Lamed Gimel, right on the top of page 3, Pasuk Yud Zayin says, okay, Moshe says, first, in Tet Zayin, the only way I'll know that you found favor is if you are with us. Pasuk Yud Zayin, v'yomer Shem al Moshe, gam et dvar zeh asher dibarta eseh, ki matzati chen b'necha v'dacha b'shem. Because that's what you requested, I will fulfill, and therefore the Ramban is pointing out that's very nice. Again, what's he really saying back to Rashi? Rashi is saying that this is ominous because this predicts the future at the point where the malach is going to go and God won't be with them, and the Ramban is saying, what are you talking about? That never happened. How can you say that we're hinting at something which didn't happen? Now Rashi would probably defend himself and say, yeah, but God threatened that, and therefore he's giving the threat, which means this is conditional. Which means, is this reversible? Is going to the land something which is guaranteed? Which then, of course, takes us right back to the Seret HaDibrot in terms of God not mentioning the land of Israel there with our one outlier. So this is essentially where I was at when I was trying to nuance all the various elements, right? I mean, again, I'd known that the malach is the issue. How do you read it? You saw a lot of Rishonim read it in a positive way. Rashi reads this in the more haunting way. The haunting way may fit in really well with what we've seen in the Servitudes. Okay, what happens if we don't, And even over here, in Mishpatim, it sounded very much like if you do, and we have to ask, well, what if you don't? Which is that annoying question. And then I came across, first of all, if you want to know how I came across it, there's a book called the Tzedek Laderech, and the Tzedek Laderech told me to look at the Maseh Hashem. So I just have to pause a second. I don't have the book at home, the Maseh Hashem. I wish I do, but I don't. So maybe I have to find it one day. The reason why I have to find it is because every time I've seen something quoted from it, I've loved it. I just absolutely loved what he wrote. I think what he does over here is absolutely breathtaking, and which means you better be impressed, and if not, then I will. I'll tell you in a second. I will pursue a different audience. That's all. Who's worthy of this, but it's. The second that I saw that he speaks about it, so I was looking forward. So source 14, Maseh Hashem. I gave you a little bit of biographical background, a little bit, first name. I can tell you more about him. Rabbi Eliezer Ashkenazi ben Rabbi Elia Harofeh. Now, if you look him up, again, 1513 to 1586. If you look him up, you're going to see the most remarkable life. First of all, just in terms of the geography. I mean, he's born in Europe. He ends up getting educated, I believe, in Turkey. He ends up becoming a rabbi in Egypt. He goes back to Posen. He ends up in Prague. He ends up in, which means just the travels that he made seemed so improbable. I mean, you would probably have thought that people just didn't do that kind of thing in those days. And if they did, how in the world, I don't know how many points he had, But it really is fascinating, the places that he went and the places that he was rabbi and how all of this is reasonable. But he wrote a book called Maseh Hashem, and let's just pause there for a second. That's such a great name for a book. I mean, it's bombastic. Maseh Hashem, God's works. So we're going to start in Chelek Maseh Torah. Later, we're going to look at Chelek Maseh Mitzrayim. But Chelek Maseh Torah, he writes, "V'meshelo huskar schar bekol aseret hadibrot zulati binyan kibud aveim yipale ma'od." He said it's actually amazing, but he's going to say something amazing. V'gam omro leman yarichin yamecha al adama ke'am aspik amru leman yarichin yamecha. Right? You have a long life. Why ha'adama? Why the stress? Can we say it our way? Why the stress why the Zionist perspective? Why the stress on the land of Israel? Umanyan hadamalakan. What does it have to do with the land? Are you really going to say that outside the land of Israel you don't have to honor your parents? You notice that's source 15. This was a warning. Who was the owner of the land before we got here? Answer, Kahn. V'Knan b'meshelo nahag kavod la'aviv. Kahn did not have honor of his father. Nitkalel shaya eved avadim la'echav. So we're going to have to look at some of the verses to understand what just now happened. Again, the question over here, only just one technical point, Kahn or Ham, who's the one who had lack of the honor, and what exactly Ham did, what exactly Kahn did, the Torah doesn't tell us clearly. U'Mitzrayim haya echiv shel Kahn, v'Yisrael hayu avadim leMitzrayim, lekach nitna eretz Kahn liYisrael, sheyitkayem eved avadim yeh le'echav. Now, you may not have followed that, but that was breathtaking, what he just now did. Imkain nitgaresh Kanan me'eretz Yisrael lefi shezilzel b'kibud aviv l'chein ne'emar po sheyichabdu horim k'dei shelo ta'abed mehem eretz Yisrael kasher ne'evda miknan. So, let me start all over again and ask you perhaps a different question. When is the first time servitude is mentioned in the Torah? I told you this is all about servitude. Who are you serving? Or as Bob Dylan said, you got to serve somebody, right? Who, which was his Christian phase. Who's the first person where servitude is mentioned? Where is it mentioned the first time? Answer, as far as I know, right over here, which is Bereshit, Perek Tet, after the flood, which is also Babylon. Anyway, before the flood. So, no, this is after the flood. So, in source 15, he does this again, and he does it in a much deeper way, and I'm just going to leave that for you as a present, because he says all the same things, explains it a little bit more, and I want to look at the verses first. In source 16, which first of all begins right after the flood, and it begins with a covenant, which by the way is interesting because that's really where we started today. We're making this covenant. It's the covenant that there'll never be a destruction like this. There won't be a flood, and somebody else should have raised their hand and said, well, what if we do bad? Will there be a different kind of a destruction? And God, well, I never said there won't be. So, and we have the rainbow, and I'll remember, God says, I'll remember the covenant, and so on. And that ends, Pasuk Yud Zayin, the covenant, and so on. Pasuk Yud Chet, V'yu b'nei Noach yotzim min haTivah, Shem Cham v'Yafet. V'Cham hu avi Knan. So already Cham is introduced and Kahn is introduced. So why we're not sure, and what Kahn is doing there we don't know. Noach becomes an Ish Adama, which again is part of our issue here as well. He drinks, becomes intoxicated, he rolls around naked on the ground. Vayar Cham avi Knan et irvat aviv. So Cham, the father of Kahn. Now we don't know what Kahn did. Kahn's going to become cursed over here. Vayaged l'shtei achav b'chutz. And we don't know what kind of tone of voice he uses when he says this. Is he being disrespectful? Is being respectful? We don't know how Kahn is taking this. Vayar Cham avi Knan et irvat aviv. Vayaged l'shnei achav b'chutz. So that clearly sounds that it is Cham speaking. Vayikach Shem v'Yafet. Etzem le'vesimu al shechem shnehem, and they walk backwards not to see Ervat Avihim. V'yiketz noch min ovidat asher asalo beno hakatan. And their part of the question is, what does his young son mean there, beno hakatan? Is that Cham, or is that his grandson, or is that Kahn? I'm just saying is that there is a lack of clarity over here. V'yomer arur Knan eved avadim ye le'echav. So what is? So remember we noted that term back all the way from the beginning today. You should be my Eved and not Eved Avadim. So the first person who's called an Eved Avadim is actually, we're find it's Kahn. Kahn is Eved Avadim, Yeh Le'echav. Vayomer Baruch Hashem Le'elokei Shem. What did the Maseh Hashem actually say? He said that the Eved Avadim Le'echav is who? Is Am Yisrael. The one that I skipped, the longer discussion in source 15, he actually is explaining why is it that Am Yisrael had to become slaves specifically in Egypt. If you want, you can look back where it's bolded in the beginning of 15. The first one, he talks about Egypt being there is some kind of an epicenter over here, and leaving Egypt will leave much more of an impact upon the world. But he continues and he says, again, we're going to go a little bit down, like 10 lines down, also where it's bolded, that the other reason over here, maybe the end of the previous bold paragraph, Ligalot ervato, vaviv kalalo sheyeh eved avadim le'echav. Hinei asa Hashem yitbarach sheYisrael yu avadim le'echav shel Knan, dahainu Mitzrayim. Kidei sheknan yeh eved liYisrael v'yitkayim sheyeh eved avadim le'echav. In order to make a little bit more sense of all this, and we're moving right now towards the end, and then we'll have to tie this up. I want you to note the Ramban at the very end in source 20. This is in Bereshit when it talks about the various descendants of Noach. Vida, Ki eretz Canaan gvulateha me'az hayta lagoy hi ru'ya liYisrael v'hi chevel nachlatam. The land of Israel is the shidduch, as it were, for the people of Israel. K'mol shenemar b'hanchel elyon goyim b'fridu b'nei adam yotzev gvulat amim lemispar b'nei Israel. Aval natna Kadosh Baruch Hu be'et hapalaga l'Knan. That God gave at the time of the dispersal, right, when all the nations were spread to different places, he gave it to Canaan. Why? B'pnei hayoto eved l'shmor ota liYisrael. So in order for them to cultivate, to work on the land, to dig the trenches, to dry up the swamps, to do all the heavy lifting, in order to get the land ready when the people of Israel come in. And then in retrospect, you come to the realization that Canaan was the slaves of, again, the curse that they get from Noah is that they become slaves. Eved avadim le'echav. They're going to become the servants of their brother. And that was the whole point of the Maseh Hashem. His whole point was to say that why do we have to be so careful? Let's make sure we don't lose focus here. Why do we have to be so careful with Kibbut Avim? And why is Kibbut Avim mentioned specifically in terms of the loss of land? Is because the curse that goes to Ham and by extension then goes to Canaan goes back to disrespecting the father, or perhaps the grandfather, disrespecting Noah. Because of that, they end up being cursed and as slaves and losing land. But what was the curse of slaves? So he says we'll be very focused on what the curse was, that the servants of your brother you will end up becoming servants to them. So now the Ramban did not go in that same direction. He did not tell over that, but what he did say is that in retrospect, we're going to figure out that Canaan is going to end up, and when I skipped over here an interesting comment of the Chatam Sofer, that what Canaan is going to end up doing if they want to stay, they can end up stay and take jobs of in the service industry. Let's put it that way, in terms of what if they do want to stay here. But on the other hand, what the Ramban is saying in retrospect, all the work they did over here is the preparatory work, which means when God also says, I'm not going to bring you in all at once, and we're not going to kick them out all at once. No, the land needs to be cultivated. The land needs to be taken care of. Let's just tie all of this up again. I mean, what really was the line that went all the way through? It was one of servitude. It goes back to Anochi. The Anochi is the very first dibur, and now in Mishpatim, where do we start? We start with servitude, which means I broke you out of slavery. I gave you economic, political, religious freedom. Can you revert back into a situation of losing economic freedom, of losing political freedom? Can you choose to lose religious freedom? And of course, the answers to all of this, of course, it's possible. When you read that very first mishpat, which again is parallel to that first dibur, there's something which is disturbing about that. And that right away Chazal tells us, right? That was the drasha, right? Manishtana, what's going on over here? Are you really undoing Pesach? Are you really undoing putting the blood on the doorpost? Are you really undoing your liberty? And if that's true on the individual level, what was our question? Well, what happens if can this take place on a national level? But Anochi was not just about that hint that I took you out of slavery. It was don't worship any other gods. And that seems to be the key to it. We want to stay in the land of Israel. We can't worship other gods. Again, it comes down, who are you going to serve? Which means God set us free in order to be able to serve God. He didn't set us free in order to serve Canaanite gods. On the other hand, what we found is that in the Aseret HaDibrot, there's almost no mention of the land of Israel, with one exception. And that one outlier we found intriguing. The one outlying was honoring parents. When it came to all the other laws, it doesn't say anything about the land of Israel. And that we also saw in a potentially ominous way, because perhaps this is telling us that we may not live up to the rules that we need to. We may not fulfill in order to get to that other destination, or even worse, we get to the destination and we're exiled from that destination. That does not take away from us the obligation of keeping the laws. The Servitudes and the laws of the Torah apply all over wherever we go. Wherever we go, we have to keep these laws. Although, admittedly, we lose a lot of the laws. We lose the whole national sense. We lose that Rishut Harab, and we lose the Shoftim and Shotrim. We lose the ability of creating a national identity. What we have is lots of specific laws. We lose the agricultural laws. We lose the Beit HaMikdash. We lose the Sanhedrin. We lose all kinds of aspects of religion, but we still have to keep the laws. Shabbat still applies. Lo tirtzach still applies. Lo tid'af still applies. Lo tignov still applies. So all of these things are still a part, but then we still had to answer but the outlier. And the one who went and explained why that out, again, we saw an interesting comment to the Sforno. No, it's not just that, it's the first 5. Well, why the first 5? Why not all 10, as you noted? But there was just, again, a fascinating point which came back to the Maseh Hashem. What he said is that specifically the land of Israel was given to Canaan, but on a temporary basis. That the curse of servitude that he receives is because of disrespecting parents. So therefore, we're being told specifically, be careful about honoring parents. Now, a number of commentaries, you want to look at Rav Hirsch, you can look at some others, who speak about basic decency is going to be on how a person treats their parents. Can I really expect decency in terms of other relationships of a person who does not treat their mother very nicely? Which means you realize, again, in a normal relationship, the person who can't be respectful of their parents, I'm not all that optimistic that they'll be nice to their neighbors, they'll be nice to other people, they'll be nice to other people on the road, and so on and so forth. Which means it seems to be that the level of appreciation we need to have for our parents is the most profound one, because they did an incredible amount. A couple of my kids had kids in the last couple of months, and both of them, it's their first kids. I have a whole bunch of grandchildren, but both of these, they got married in the last couple of years, and they both had their first child. They both had first sons, and one had a pidyon haben, the other one's going to be next week. And I asked my son, I said, so do you like him? He goes, yeah. I said, do you love him? I said, yeah. I said, is it rational? I said, is it possible, therefore, that your parents like you more than you ever know? And he kind of looked at me and like he was processing this point. I mean, it still comes out that the love and the care and the torment that a parent has in terms of relationship towards the child is something which children never understand. Maybe when they have their own children, they begin to possibly understand it. But we need to have that appreciation to our parents. We need to respect and take care of, and anything we do is insufficient. I mean, anything that we do it's insufficient and not enough, and we think we're being special, and it's not enough. And what we're told over here is that deserving of the land of Israel, and is connected to this, because we ultimately are going to go, and again, to just complete the curse of Canaan, but it's the Eved Avadim Livno, which is us, and he's claiming that's why we had to go to Egypt, to be the servant of his brother, to come out, and then he becomes our servant, again, in different ways, either by staying in the land and then choosing to respect the new owners, or by virtue of having done, as the Ramban says, all the heavy lifting, and then presenting us a beautiful land, as God said, don't worry, I'm going to take you there, and everything will be prepared. Well, who's going to do all the preparing for us? Well, the answer is Canaan's going to do all the preparing for us. I don't know if you know this. There's actually a really interesting machloket, what we're not going to get into now, but I'll just mention it in passing. There is the special one-time law, which some of the Rishonim understand that when you enter in, it goes, I gave you all the good. So what did the good include? So there's some Rishonim will say that when you entered into the land, anything you found in the refrigerator, you're allowed to eat. So if there are pork chops in the refrigerator, you were allowed to eat them when you entered the land of Israel, because God said, I prepared for you all the good which is there. It was like a one-time thing. You can eat anything which is there. So I'll say that's like kind of like a real exaggeration of this point. But as I said, it's interesting. That's the way that Rashi seems to take it. The Rambam reads that law in a somewhat of a different way. Don't try this at home, okay? But nonetheless, what I think we've seen is something which is interesting. The extension of the Servitude Dibrot is the land of Israel. The extension of this, because again, Judaism is ultimately a part of it is the land of Israel. What part, what percentage, we can discuss, we could debate. When you look at the various extensions, I'm going to say it again, it is in Mishpatim, it is in Vayikra, it is in Dvarim. All of it leads to this macro understanding, this macro keeping of the laws, and how the Servitude Dibrot then get turned into all of these other laws. It's over here staring at us in Mishpatim. It was right there. Is this reversible? It sounds like it's reversible. We did have an academic question. I'm going to call it that. because ultimately both sides are going to agree about the larger point. There's an academic question about how we understand that malach. Is the malach something which is taking care of us, and it's a nice verse, and it's God being gentle with us, or as Rashi said, it's ominous? The Ramban, what do you mean it's ominous? Again, God is taking care of us, but we know that at the end of the day, yeah, God is taking care of us, but this is something which is reversible. And because it's reversible, we need to be careful. And maybe the best way of being careful is by having that lesson in front of us. What's the lesson that we have in front of us? What happens when we're not decent people? Well, give me an example of somebody who's not decent. I'll give you an example. Back from Bereshit, I have a great Bible story of somebody who wasn't decent. You know who that was? That was Kahn, and that was Ham, and there was something really bad about what they did, and they ended up getting cursed, they ended up becoming slaves, and it goes back to servitude, and servitude is where we began. So therefore, this issue really is one about servitude, and who, if you're going to serve God, you'll be free. That's what's interesting. You're going to serve God, you're going to be free, you'll be free in your own land. But then we see that first mishpat, a reversal, an Eved Ivri, so disturbing. An Eved Ivri, really so disturbing. And then can this happen on a national level? And apparently it can. And that's why we go back and we look at the example of Kahn, we look at the example of what happened, and essentially they become the servants. Right now they're the Balabayit. Right now they're in charge of the land of Israel, and the next moment they become the servants of those who end up taking over. That's a powerful lesson. So what do you do? No, you don't have to start with anything drastic. What do you do? Take care of your parents. What do? You start with something simple. What do? You start with the most logical mitzvah that there is. Right? The Aruch LaShulchan says it, most logical mitzvah. What do? You start with something small. Because we believe that if a nation is built upon small behavior, start with the obvious, start with taking care of your parents, hopefully there'll be a real spillover effect, and that will lead us to not just my parents, my family, just my family, my neighbors, not just my neighbors, but my neighbors' neighbors, not just them as well, but create a society which is based upon caring, based upon responsibility, based upon taking care of somebody. And if you build a society like that, then all the agricultural laws which exist, all of them make sense. And of that, then we are only going to be serving God as we are free people in our land.
Very nice.